When we think of the Bible, we often picture this single ancient book, something that's always existed in its final form. But the real story of how it was made, oh, it's way more complex, more surprising, and honestly, a lot more human than you might think. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the centuries long process that took a bunch of scattered stories and letters and turned them into the Christian Bible. So, where did the Bible actually come from? The easy assumption is that it just appeared, right? One complete book with a perfect table of contents. But that's not how it happened at all. It was actually forged in fiery debates, controversies, and a long, kind of messy process of people deciding what was in and what was out. Okay, so to really get our heads around this journey, we have to crack a critical code first. And that means understanding the difference between two keywords, scripture and canon. They sound similar, but trust me, they are not the same thing. Think of it this way. Scripture is a really broad term. For early Christians, they had tons of writings they considered holy or important. That's scripture. But a canon, that's something totally different. It's a definitive closed list. It's the official collection where some books make the cut and a whole lot of others are left out. And this is pretty cool. The word canon actually comes from the Greek word for a measuring rod. It was literally a standard, a ruler they used to measure which books fit the standard and which ones didn't. This wasn't some accident. It was a very deliberate process of choosing. All right, here's a little pop quiz for you. What do you think were the very first books of the New Testament to be written? Most people would say the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, they're about Jesus' life, so they have to be the oldest, right? Well, that's actually wrong. The earliest Christian writings that we have are actually the letters from the Apostle Paul, starting around 50 AD. The very first Gospel, Mark, wasn't written until about 20 years later. That means for decades, the most important texts for this brand new movement were basically personal mail, not biographies of Jesus. And you gotta remember how these letters got around. There's no printing press, no email, it was all organic. A church would get a letter, they'd have scribes copy it out by hand, and then they'd pass those copies to other communities. And over time, these letters became so important that people started calling them scripture in their own right. So after Paul's letters had been circulating for a while, people finally started writing down the stories about Jesus' life and teachings. But this didn't just lead to the 4 Gospels we know today. No, what happened was more like a flood. The whole thing happened in stages. For about 40 years after Jesus died, all the stories about him were just passed down by word of mouth. Then people started writing down collections of his sayings. And finally, you had authors who started researching all these different sources to put together complete narratives, the books we now call Gospels. And this created what was basically a marketplace of stories. In the 2nd century, it wasn't just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Oh no. You also had the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, all of them circulating at the same time. So how on earth did we end up with just 4? Well, the answer, weirdly enough, comes from a guy who the church later declared a heretic. His really radical ideas were the catalyst that forced all these scattered Christian groups to finally start making some tough decisions. Meet Marcion of Sinope. He was a rich shipowner who showed up in Rome around 150 AD with a bombshell of an idea. He taught that the God of the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, was a totally different, angry, lesser God than the loving Father of Jesus. So his conclusion? Christians needed to ditch the Old Testament completely. And to prove his point, Marcion created the very first Christian canon. He threw out all the Jewish scripture, he only included 1 gospel, a heavily edited version of Luke, and 10 of Paul's letters, which he also edited to cut out anything nice about the Jewish God. For the mainstream Christians at the time, this was a full-blown crisis. You see what he did there? He basically forced their hand. By making his own list, his own canon, he raised a question that nobody could ignore anymore. If Marcion's list is the wrong one, then what's the right one? Answering that question did not happen overnight, not even close. In fact, it kicked off this massive debate that just raged across the entire Roman Empire for the next 200 years. It was anything but neat and tidy. And the different lists were all over the place. I mean, you had an early list from around 200 AD that included a book called the Apocalypse of Peter, but left out Hebrews. Then you have a famous early Bible from 150 years later that includes books like the Shepherd of Hermas. It wasn't until the year 367 that a church leader named Athanasius wrote down the first list that perfectly matches the 27 books we have in our New Testament today. So, how did they finally decide? Well, they kind of used a three-point checklist. First, antiquity. Was it really old and connected to an apostle? Second, general acceptance. Was it popular and being used by churches everywhere? But the most important one, the real tiebreaker, was theology. Did the book's message fit with what the majority of church leaders already believed? If it didn't, it was out. Simple as that. So by the late 4th century, the big debate over the New Testament was mostly settled. That list from Athanasius became the gold standard. You might think, great, case closed, but not so fast. The story isn't over, and there's one last pretty big twist. That date, 367 AD, is a huge moment. It's the first time in history that we see our familiar 27-book New Testament all listed out. But remember, a letter from one bishop in Egypt wasn't exactly a binding law for all of Christianity. And that's because even with the New Testament sorted out, people were still arguing about which Jewish scriptures should be included in the Old Testament. The debate, believe it or not, wasn't over. In fact, and this is probably the most surprising part of this whole story, that debate is still technically going on today. The Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, which is based on the Hebrew Bible. But the Roman Catholic Old Testament has 46 books. It includes 7 extra books, called the Apocrypha, that were in the Greek translation early Christians used. So even today, the Bible isn't one single, universally agreed-upon book. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. The Bible didn't just fall out of the sky. Its table of contents is the result of centuries of very human debates, arguments, and theological choices. So, knowing all this history, how does that change the way we approach and read these texts today?